Um, well, yeah, it's architectonical finds from house features I'm going to look at, and it's sort of the focus is how do we distinguish between different kinds of house fires, and how can these different house fires, what can they tell about the activities that took place in the old houses? And I've chosen to focus on the period from the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age in Denmark, where we have the sort of the period of the two-aisled longhouse. It's a period where we have a lot of carbonized finds, but it's from a number of different features. But it's also a period where you could say where it's quite problematic to you can discuss them in many different ways, these features. So what we're doing in Moscow, we're doing museum work. So it's what I'm going to talk about here is also the results of analysis from rescue excavations. So it's kind of the normal situations you will be seeing here, but I'd say it will often be normal situations on a good day and sometimes on a very good day. So to set the stage, in Moscow we get quite a lot of carbonized finds. In some cases we get them in very large amounts of carbonized grain, and when we do that we can of course question if they come from a major fire in a house, especially if we find the carbonized remains sort of spread out in features throughout the house, and also if they are sort of combined with other elements like burnt clay, for instance, or sort of heavily distorted, either inorganic or organic matter. I think we could call it different things. They would call it petrified ash. I heard the name yesterday. But things like that shows that very high temperatures have taken place in these features. Archaeologically, it's well known that we have burned surprisingly amount of burned houses in Denmark, and sometimes you can see that these houses are clearly unintentionally burned or accidentally burned. One example, not from the period I'm going to talk about, from the late Iron Age, is a very clear example that I think we discussed that kind of find yesterday. This is from the Tell site, Nørretranders, from around the birth of Christ, where you see in the bottom you have a sort of a stable end that has completely burned with the remains of animals and human bones still lying inside. And of course on these houses there could be a lot of post-depositional things going on, but still to some extent we expect that these kinds of finds will very possibly very much show the material, reflect the material that was in the house when the house burned, and reflect the find situation at that time. To show this find again, here you see how it was interpreted, the bones in this house. You see all the animals were lying in the stables, and you see the humans probably trying to get the animals out, but then died in the attempt. And the reason for in recent years, especially in the recent years, it's become an increasing discussion that sometimes these major fires were perhaps not all unintentional. Perhaps they were also intentionally burned houses. I think this discussion has partially arisen because we see quite a lot of presumably burned houses, but on some of these, especially these Iron Age houses, it also seems like they've been clearly people have taken stuff out before the house burned. There are no ceramics inside in the finds, so that could be an indicator of that. So why should you intentionally burn a house? Of course, there's been some theories I've counted about that. It could be a ritual, of course. A fire has been proposed, and of course one can imagine a lot of ritual significance connected to fires. But one could also imagine a lot of practical reasons to burn a house. If it's old, you could burn it to clear the area if you wanted to build another house on the spot, for instance. And now I'm moving to the period I'm going to talk about, because there we also have the discussion about intentional burned houses. Sometimes you find features close to the house. For instance, you find plow marks on top of the houses. Of course, it's hard to know what the time difference is between plow mark and house features, but I've heard several archaeologists talking about, for instance, sunken features. You can find plow marks also into the sunken features, which I think indicates that the plowing must have happened quite shortly afterwards. So perhaps you also burned houses to make a field on the spot afterwards. In this period where it seems like sort of activity areas moved around very much, you would have, of course, a very nice area. Well, it would be a clear area, and it would be probably an area with a very high nutritious value also to make a field. But how do we interpret finds from these kinds of houses? Of course, obviously there has been activities taking place before the house, because you moved things out, and also post-depositional factors. But to some extent, I think the carbonized material would probably still, I assume, to some extent sort of reflect the material that was in the house, that was sort of left in the house at the time of burning. At least what we see very often, it's very hard when we look at carbonized finds to see if something was intentionally or unintentionally burned, but we clearly see that carbonized material, carbonized food remains very often concentrate in specific post holes, particularly parts of the house, and we can also see specific concentrations of grain. So the difference between these two kinds of house fires are not necessarily that big, I'd say. A much bigger problem would probably be to distinguish between these major house fires and then all the carbonized material that arrives from everyday activities that take place in the houses. And that can, of course, be hard when the carbonized material is the amount is not that big. For instance, obviously activities, features inside a house like a fireplace would still show an activity in the house, but of course it can be from, you could have several fireplaces and they could represent activities that took place at several times during the lifetime of the house, and also you would probably find gradually deposited carbonized material that would sort of deposit throughout the lifetime of the house. So that could be quite difficult. And the interpretation of these different features, you find, of course, depend very much on what kind of feature it is we're dealing with. And in this period, the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age in Denmark, we mainly receive carbonized finds from fireplaces and pits and sunken floors, a special feature, and then post holes. So, but I'll go through those. The easiest feature is probably, I'd say, is probably fireplaces. They, not surprisingly, probably typically contain remains of fuel and perhaps a little bit food remains, and also remains from cereal cleaning, that probably these activities that probably took place close to the fireplace. Another more difficult feature is probably to interpret carbonized material from pits. Surprisingly, specifically in this period, we find pits that are filled with sometimes filled with carbonized grain. And how do you interpret that? Pits. Yeah, first of all, it can be difficult to interpret if the pit at all. If you find a pit inside a house, does it even belong to the house? Because there could be a lot of activity involving depositing carbonized material all around on the site. So it could be just coincidentally present inside the house. But pits can, of course, be used for a number of purposes, for making food and stuff. But two major explanations are often used to interpret these pits. Either that they were used for storage of grain, And the other one is that they were used for just for depositing grain that had carbonized somewhere else, and that's because in many cases there are actually no traces of burnings inside the pits, so it can be very hard to see. So, but why they deposited? It could be trash, and it could be some have proposed it's ritual, or perhaps it's ritual trash. Who knows? There's a lot of rituals, I think, connected to trash also on truss deposits. But to show a very clear example of where I say this is storage did indeed take place inside houses, we have I think that's the best example I've come up with here is from the site of Petersborg West in eastern Jutland, where we have 3 pits. Here's a house here with a 2-aisle house with post holes in some way, and then you have a sunken floor, and under the sunken floor you had 3 pits filled with grain, perhaps about 30 liters of carbonized grain. And lining these pits you have actually remains of burnt wooden containers still. So that's a quite good indicator that it was actually at this place stored and probably burnt we assume due to an accidental fire, since it was such large amounts. But I've taken another more unclear example that we examined some, I think, 10 years ago from a site called Ingehøj, also between late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, about 1900 something to 1700 something BC. We have again a 2-aisle longhouse here. These big grey things here are posthole sort of traces, and then you have something sunken floor area or some sunken area here, but you have these 2 pits lying over here that were interpreted as belonging to the house. They were dated, carbon-14 dated, and they turned out to have exactly the same date as the grain inside the house, and there was also grain in the house, but there was about 5 liters of grain in these 2 pits up here. But you could say they lie a bit peripheral still compared to how the house was designed. And one other problem is that you had actually on this site you had a number of other pits filled with grain lying scattered around, apparently without connection to houses. So that shows and there were no signs of traces in these pits. So that shows the problem of interpretation here. Then it's probably easier to interpret the carbonized finds from the sunken floors, because we have a handful of, I think now, of sunken floors in the houses from this period in Denmark. It's a relatively well-known feature, especially from Jutland, that part of the floor was sort of, for some reason, perhaps to get more space in some areas, it was dug down, especially the eastern parts. There could be sunken features. And in a few cases we have a huge amount of grains lying on the floor level of these houses, indicating that there was some kind of, accidental fire probably in the house, and the grain probably represents grain that was stored in this part of the house and then fell down, or at least was spread out through on the floor level and was preserved there. A few, I think 5-6 years ago, we got a very good example from a site called Hestehaven, eastern Jutland, just south of Aarhus, where we actually went out and participated also. Because they called us because they had found this sunken feature, and when they got down they could see there was a sort of an 8 to 10 centimeter thick layer lying on this floor, containing carbonized grain. So we went out and made a strategy. We made here's the house, and you can see in the eastern part the sunken floor, where we divided into half-meter squares. So it could it's actually, I think, the first time in Denmark it's been. So it's not that common to sample in more methodological ways, but it was divided like that, and I was taking samples from different artificial layers, down through this grain concentration. And through screening, it was possible to pinpoint most of these samples was just different crops mixed together. But through screenings, it's not a very nice picture. But the important thing is that it was possible to find different concentrations of different crops in a few of the samples. It's in Latin there, but what is important is that you have, we could see different concentrations along the sides here. Here's hull barley and wheat here, and naked barley in top. So there were definitely several crops here that probably fell down and meant that it was spread in most of the sunken feature. But what was also regarding methodology and sampling interesting for us was that we could also sample the post holes lying beneath the sunken floor layer. We estimated, I must say that was probably about 37 liters of grain lying on the floor, this sunken floor here. But we looked at the post holes, at least in some of the post holes here, but you can see this is the post hole under the sunken layer, and these are two other post holes lying outside of the sunken floor layer area. The post hole fill underneath the sunken floor was contained about 900, estimate of about 900 carbonized grains. Here in this the big one, and that leads us onto the discussion of the biggest find group we have, and that is the finds from post holes fill, that we often interpret as is often the only thing we have, and where we also often interpret them as signs of burned houses. It's well known for archaeobotanical, but it's of course the theory that if you take a sample from here, it should show the material from when the house was abandoned, when the post was either burned away or rotted away and were pulled up. So that's preferably, of course, we take samples from that part of the post hole, but it's not always possible to see any differences. But that's preferably how we do it. But how then? One thing I thought about was about these 900 grains. It's because I think, of course, it's a lot of grains, but still, you have the whole of the post hole fill. I think in many normal excavations, you have parts of the post hole plowed away, will be ground down. So I think 900 grains to represent a find of 37 liters of grain is still not that much. So how do we interpret the more normal finds we have? And then I have taken a more typical example in the end here to discuss the more normal situation. This is a find we looked at a few years ago from eastern Denmark. It's from close to Copenhagen, where they found 5 houses from the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, of which 4 contained carbonized material in relatively large amounts. You cannot follow these numbers. It's been recalculated. There was a lot of size difference in the sample size difference, so it's this is grains per liter in this one, and the other one is a grain per 10 liter. But in the house where there was this one, where there was the most amount of grains, there was about an estimate of about 1,300 grains in this post hole here, and I can show the 4 other samples. The one where there was the least amount of grain was this one, where there was about 70 grains. But still, they all show the same pattern of with a clear concentration of the grain in the western part of the house, which is something new, because in the Jutland finds they seem to be concentrated in more in the eastern parts of the houses. So that's a new trend. And we also have grain all through the house. So my interpretation, a problem with these is there were not that much charcoal, and there was not all these other things like burnt clay and stuff. But my interpretation of these finds would still be that it probably represent, I would say, burnt houses, because when we have huge finds from large excavations, we normally see that lots of houses don't really contain much carbonized material, and then we have some that pop out with so even 70 grains is, I would say, was, and also because you have a pattern. But that's sort of also open for discussion and suggestions. Thank you.